Tamamdır. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for being with us virtually today for the 36th episode of Science and Society Meetings. I am Kamala Valieva, and I am a faculty member at the Department of Political Science and International Relations here at Istanbul Ticaret University. And I will be moderating this event here today, which is dedicated to the issue of confrontational mutual perceptions and images of Islam, Muslim world and the West, and in that scope, the emergence of global Islamophobia. And to help us understand this much pressing issue, it's our great pleasure and honor to be joined this evening by an excellent scholar, who I think it is fair to say is among the world's most distinguished experts on Islam, Dr. John Esposito. A warm welcome to you, Professor, and thanks again for joining us. Before we start off, let me introduce Dr. Esposito to our audience and also briefly outline his incredible work in the field of Islamic studies. John Esposito is a university professor and professor of religion and international affairs and founding director of the Alawite Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and the Bridge Initiative, protecting pluralism, ending Islamophobia at Georgetown University in the United States. He is the past president of the American Academy of Religion and Middle East Studies Association. He has also served as a consultant to the US Department of State and other agencies, as well as European and Asian governments, corporations, universities, and also international media. He also served as an ambassador for the UN Alliance of Civilizations and was a member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders. Dr. Esposito's more than 60 books include such works as, for example, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, Who Speaks for Islam, What a Billion Muslims Really Think, Unholy War, Terror in the Name of Islam, Islam and Democracy After the Arab Spring, and also Islamophobia and the Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century, actually co-edited with Ibrahim Kalın, and also Islamophobia and Radicalization, Breeding Intolerance and Violence as one of the latest books edited by Dr. Esposito. Dr. Esposito's books and articles have been translated into more than 45 languages, including Turkish. And also Dr. Esposito is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Islamic Studies Online and series editor of the Oxford Library of Islamic Studies. He served as editor-in-chief of the 6-volume Oxford Encyclopedia of the Islamic World. And Esposito is also a frequent contributor to the media in the United States, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. And his articles appear in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, and many other international media outlets. So with this introduction, I would like to give the floor to Professor Yücel Uğurlu to deliver his welcoming speech.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Valieva. Today we have a very important guest, one of the most famous scholars on this field that you mentioned now. I would like to extend my greetings, first of all, to all. And dear Professor Esposito, dear academic staff and our students, welcome to the 36th Science and Society meetings organized by Istanbul Ticaret University. When I became the rector of Istanbul Ticaret University in 2019, we launched this series, Science and Society Meetings Conferences, with the aim of bringing together the world's leading scholars in various fields and with the awareness that universities has an obligation to serve the society they live in. We are glad to have this conference here this evening. While the promotions of this conference started, I was serving as the rector of Istanbul Ticaret University. A few days ago, I was appointed as the rector of Balıkesir State University. So in that capacity also, let me once again extend my warm wishes and welcome you all. During this organization of this episode of the event, I was excited to inform that Professor John Esposito will deliver this lecture to our audience because he has come to fore in recent years with his works on the Islamic world and Islamophobia. And his reasonable statements in this field are really very important for us. And these ideas can serve as a guide for all of us. I believe that your experience in this field, in this religious studies and Islamic Islamophobia and subjects related to Islam, and your knowledge and wisdom will greatly deepen our students' understanding of the current issues of Islam and international affairs. For that reason, I want to thank you, Professor, for accepting our invitation to deliver this lecture. I would also like to thank the university staff for their work and our audience for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. I'm delighted to be here. And I've been to Turkey many times over the years, but it's always interesting. This is the first time I've done, I think, a virtual program with Turkey and specifically with Istanbul. Let me begin briefly with a couple of biographical notes about myself and the state of Islam before the Iranian Revolution. When I decided in the late 60s and early 70s to study Islam, it was initially very reluctant. I actually went to Temple University to do a PhD in a different area, but I was encouraged to study Islam, and I was reluctant. I didn't know anything about it, and as far as I was concerned, it was invisible generally in terms of academia and even in America at that time. But I agreed to take one course with Ismail al-Faruqi, a Palestinian, and basically that changed my life. I was very fortunate that in class, at least 80% of the students were from the Muslim world. Ismail scholarships for them, and so we had a strong representation there. Unfortunately, you're hearing my telephone. I'm sorry about that ringing right now. For many of my friends, their sense, hold on, I'm going to try. Okay, it's stopping. Good. For many of my friends, they said to me, why are you studying this stuff? You never get a job. And so when I finished my degree and I had to look for a job, they were right. There were no jobs to just teach Islam. Fortunately, I was trained in 4 different religions, and therefore I could teach world religions. It wasn't until the Iranian Revolution that there was any interest in what I did. It's also important to note that at that time, in most colleges and universities and schools, Islam was invisible. It was invisible in terms of the training in diplomats. No one thought that it was important to necessarily train diplomats in the religion and culture of the countries that they were going to, or of the military. It was invisible in the Middle East Studies Association, which is major association of Middle East scholars, and in the American Academy of Religion, it was invisible. So it's against that background that we now look at and talk about the situation. In the America that existed at that time, religion in the West and in Europe, so it's in the West itself also, really meant primarily Christianity and Judaism. Yes, there were Muslims living in the country, but not great numbers, and they were usually identified, people were identified by their national background, Egyptian, Iranian, Turkish, etc. Religion at that time was seen as a matter of personal faith, but not to be in politics in the public square. The idea was that society should be secular and that there should be a separation, if you will, of church and state. Religion was viewed as having no place in politics and international relations and governments. The reigning approach to the world was to talk about modernization and development theory, which was based on the idea really of a kind of Western secularism and separation of religion and state. And indeed, there was a famous book written at the time called The Passing of Traditional Society, in which the author said, and I quote, that the choice for Muslims was between Mecca and mechanization, okay? Social scientists, government analysts, foreign service officers, academic specialists were neither trained nor equipped to see or understand the potential significance of the emergence that was already taking place of Islam in Muslim politics before the Iranian Revolution. You could see it emerging in Libya, Sudan, Egypt, Jordan, Pakistan, Malaysia. Now, when we turn to the Iranian Revolution, okay, the Iranian Revolution occurred, and it involved a country that in the West in general was seen as very modern. The Shah and his wife were seen as modern. Why? Because when they came to our country, they dressed in modern dress. They spoke English. Iran had relations with the US, with Europe, and it had the second largest military after Israel, and of course, oil wealth. So the Iranian Revolution at the time then stunned Western governments and also many Middle Eastern rulers. And in fact, for, if you will, authoritarian rulers, there was a grave concern there that this might spread. And indeed, Ayatollah Khomeini had called for the spread of the revolution. And there were some uprisings in the Gulf area and in some other areas. The Iranian Revolution challenged, therefore, Western governments, policymakers, and experts to take the role of religion in politics seriously. But few were equipped to understand the nature and diversity and dynamics of religion in politics and society, and particularly Islam. I was invited to do a briefing. I was invited by the Secretary of State and a number of our colleagues, including a prominent Muslim scholar named Fazlur Rahman from Pakistan, but who was teaching at the University of Chicago. And we went and briefed the Office of the Secretary of State and also National Security Council officials and staff. And in that conversation, as concerned as they were, there was no sense of the background. You know, who was Khomeini? What role did religion actually play in Iran? You know, et cetera. Now, post the Iranian Revolution, we begin to see the emergence in a very clear way of the notion of an Islamic threat seen within the context of a clash of civilizations. Political events after the Iranian Revolution, with Khomeini's call for the spread of the Islamic Revolution, led many government leaders, policymakers, and media commentators in the 1980s and 1990s to warn of a global Islamic threat. Now, this phrase, clash of civilizations, in its context and used at that time, was used in 1996 by prominent Harvard professor Samuel P. Huntington. He did an article called The Clash of Civilizations, and then 2 years later, a book. He also was somebody who had served in government, so he had a wide following. And he talked about the dangers of a clash between Islam and the West, and referred to Islam, saying it had bloody borders and bloody innards. Now, bloody borders, he could have said Muslim countries had bloody borders, recognizing, though, that Muslim countries, many of them, for example, in Egypt, Sudan, etc., for a number of them, they fight among themselves, rather than saying Islam has bloody borders. That implies the religion has bloody borders. And when he said, then added the phrase bloody innards, that meant the very, if you will, the innards, the very inside or substance of Islam. Huntington's book became a global bestseller and had significant global impact. I can remember friends from different Muslim countries getting in touch with me, or if they saw me at a conference, wanting me to present their invitation of Huntington to go to their country. These were people in the Arab world as well as in Malaysia. And indeed, Huntington and I debated in Saudi Arabia on the subject of clash of civilizations between Islam and the West. So this idea then grew until Islam was portrayed as a triple threat: a political threat, a civilizational threat, and a demographic threat. In other words, as one author, Daniel Pipes, who's a critic of much of what happens with regard to Islam in the Muslim world, put it in an article that he wrote, "The Muslims are coming, the Muslims are coming." And it was reflected in an article by Pat Buchanan, who was somebody in politics, also a writer, ran for or wanted to run for president And he wrote an article that stated that while the West was being challenged by the political threat of Islam in the Middle East, domestically in Europe, there was also a problem, a Muslim problem, if you will. The idea that the Muslim population was a political threat. And so he talked about the fact, and he used this kind of example. I don't remember the exact words, but he talked about something like, as Turkish doctors, he did use that phrase, as a Turkish doctor or Turkish doctors, you know, labored long to make money to support their large families, and their families that were getting bigger and bigger. These doctors, many of them were doctors who worked with women who, and in effect, with German women who wanted abortions, for example, or to avoid having a child. And therefore, it was the German population will be strict, you know, the indigenous German population will be getting smaller and smaller, and the immigrant population will be getting bigger and bigger. But it wasn't until 9/11 and the war on global terrorism, the so-called war on global terrorism, that you really had this very, if you will, global sense and involvement of countries both in the West and the Muslim world. 9/11 and Al-Qaeda's terrorist attacks in America and Europe and elsewhere, and later the significant emergence and spread of ISIS and its caliphate movement, which slaughtered Muslims and non-Muslims alike, as well as foreigners, fed a kind of anti-Islam rhetoric and politics in the West, a fear of Islam and Muslims and politics. In other words, there was no distinction being made between extremists and terrorists who were dangerous, who had to be taken care of, but who were a relatively small percentage of the enormous population, if you will, of global Islam and of also the Muslim world. Instead, what emerged was a sense to think of Islam and Muslims as inherently militant or susceptible to militancy, and therefore a threat in the West and internationally. After 9/11, George Bush and Tony Blair announced this global war on terrorism. So here, right in the heart of the name, is this sense of the global, and that one would go any place, you know, in the world, that it could occur any place in the world. All of this emerged in light of Al-Qaeda's attacks in New York and Washington, and then its attacks in Europe and globally. These fed not just fear of extremists and terrorism, but also, sadly, a fear of the religion of Islam and Muslims, which has had a significant impact on Muslim liberties in America and Europe, then and continuing now. To give you an example of the reaction after 9/11, now remember, for Americans, this was, you know, a stunning event, and not fathomable for Americans. It was the first and a major attack on heartland America. And in one day, it killed some 3,000 people. The reaction to that, because government wasn't prepared to deal with it, can be seen in a book by David Cole, a Georgetown law professor. The book is called Less Safe, Less Free. Less Safe, Less Free. And by the way, for students, it's a very good and easy read, in which he noted that in the immediate aftermath, the US government locked up over 5,000 foreign nationals in preventive detention in the first 2 years after 9/11. It sought out also 8,000 Arab and Muslim men for FBI interviews. It called in 80,000 Arab and Muslim foreign nationals for special registration, fingerprinting, and photographing. The idea was to find terrorists in our midst. But the government's record, according to Cole, was zero. Now, this did not mean that there weren't terrorists, that we didn't have some extremists who either lived in the country and others who came in and had terrorist attacks. But he was talking about the immediate reaction after, and the fact that in many ways the usual kinds of laws and legal approach was put aside as one tried to defend and hunt down these terrorists, and it affected everything, the way we would fly, all the security measures that never existed at airports, the fear if one was flying at that time about who would be there and what would happen. It's important again for me to just reiterate, this was not to deny subsequent problems with domestic terrorism in the US and in Europe, but it's to highlight an amazing overreaction that required, or should have required, a more reasoned and sane response. So let's talk a little bit here about Western perceptions of an Islamic threat and how they have been reflected in the last decade or so with regard to American foreign policy in the Middle East, and specifically with regard to the democratically elected governments in Egypt and Tunisia in what was called the Arab Spring. In the aftermath of the Arab Spring, the center that I direct, the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, co-sponsored a conference in Istanbul with SETA, which included Arab Spring leaders and activists, including Islamists from Egypt and Tunisia, as well as Jordan, Libya, Syria, etc. What was notable was that there are a lot of different ideas, obviously, in these discussions. But despite differences, there was a common agreement on two primary concerns. The deep state in Tunisia and Egypt, that is, as many said, in contrast to American and French revolutions, where the entrenched elites and those that caused it were killed, imprisoned, or marginalized, in Tunisia and Egypt, you would still have the deep state. That is, the offices of government, security forces, military that had existed there during Mubarak and Ben Ali's time. But the other question that they asked, and this is very important in terms of understanding the response to the Arab Spring, was whether the US and Europe, or the EU, would really accept the overthrow of authoritarian rulers like Mubarak and Ben Ali. Would they really accept it? Not just initially say something, would they accept it? And you could see it in the first reactions. Certainly with regard to the United States, you would have the president, Mr. Obama, or the Secretary of State, and one of them would acknowledge that Mubarak had been, a longtime ally. I think he probably was an ally through the terms of some 7 American presidents. But on the other hand, you'd have the other person in the leadership of America saying that America recognized the people and what they did. But in fact, the US and EU responses were somewhat reluctant. They were conditioned by attitudes and responses that had been held for decades in terms of Western policy or foreign policy towards the Middle East. That is, countries like the US and European countries that might say, or Britain, for example, that in their foreign policy, that they both affirm the importance of democracy and promote its spread. But in fact, when it came to the Middle East, there was a double standard in the promotion of self-determination and democracy. There was, as it were, a democracy deficit in the Middle East. Support for authoritarian allies and ambivalence and fear of Islamists was very much part of what was going on. Authoritarian allies for a number of decades would come to Washington or wherever and would say, in effect, we're the legitimate rulers, and any of these Islamic parties or movements, we're not even talking here specifically about confirmed terrorist groups, okay, that they're dangerous. So the failure to clearly distinguish between nonviolent and violent, between mainstream and extremist Islamists, was very much there. This reluctance can be seen in the failure then of the Obama administration when Sisi took over the country in a coup to call the overthrow of Egypt's first democratically elected president, Morsi, a coup. As one scholar said in an interview, a coup is a coup is a coup. If the military take over an elected government, we call that a coup. And a willingness of the US and EU subsequently, and certainly today, to in effect accept the legitimacy of Sisi and the regime, despite their track record in the past, the thousands that were killed in the early period in the takeover, and the many thousands that were and have been imprisoned and continue to be imprisoned and tortured, as international reports tell us. Now, an important factor here then is also to take a look at the phenomenon of Islamophobia. Islamophobia, there are many definitions, but basically the definition that we use at Georgetown and on our website for Bridge, which is bridge.georgetown.edu, is that Islamophobia is an extreme fear. Okay, it's a phobia because it's an extreme fear. It's not that there isn't that there shouldn't necessarily be a fear about extremist attacks, etc. But it's an extreme fear of and hostility towards Islam itself and Muslims in general, not just Muslim extremists, which often leads to hate speech and hate crimes, social and political discrimination. It can be used to rationalize policies such as mass surveillance of Muslim citizens in the West, incarceration, imprisonment, and disenfranchisement, and can influence domestic and foreign policy. If you want to see a discussion of this, go to bridge.georgetown.edu, and actually on the very first page, you'll see we've just come out with our 2022 reports on China, the US, Europe, India, etc. We have a whole series of reports. Significant here also with regard to attitudes towards Muslims and images of Muslims and Islam, and to the growth of Islamophobia is the role of media. The predominant role of print, electronic, and social media post 9/11 reinforced the negative image of Islam and Muslims as militant and a threat to popular culture. Studies done by an organization called Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R, major studies show this, where, for example, between 2001 and 2011, if I remember correctly, you initially, in terms of coverage of Islam in 2001, would be that, how would it go? I'm thinking now, it would be that you would be talking about 2% of the media out of 975,000 pieces of media in Europe and America, 2% portrayed, if you will, mainstream Islam and Muslims, and 0.1%, no, I'm sorry, 2% portrayed extremist and terrorist, 0.1% talked about all the Muslims in the world or what's going on. By 2011, 2% jumped to 25% of coverage of Islam in the Muslim world, emphasizing extremism and terrorism, and the coverage of mainstream remained the same as 0.1%. So Islamophobia has grown exponentially, and negative media coverage of Islam and Muslims hit then an all-time high in 2015, in which Media Tenor basically said, if you look at Europe and America, it's become normalized. Islamophobia has become normalized. Or as Baroness Warsi, a member of the House of Lords and a Muslim, said, in Britain, Islamophobia became acceptable dinner talk and conversation, to talk Islamophobically, you know. Okay. Domestic and international terrorist attacks of AQ and ISIL, mass and social media, and American presidential elections and European presidential elections have also been major catalysts in the growth of Islamophobia. Fear of Islam and Muslims then, not just militant extremist and terrorist, has become normalized in popular culture in both America and Europe. This in turn has had a significant impact on domestic policies that have threatened Muslim civil liberties, influenced the radicalization of some Muslim and non-Muslim extremists, and informed and legitimate Western foreign policies, from the invasion and occupation of Iraq, for example, and Afghanistan, to U.S. responses to the Arab Spring, and then to the Arab Winter, if you will, the post period where we saw a coup in Egypt, and more recently, the equivalent of a coup in Tunisia, and continued U.S. and EU support for authoritarian allies. What about these social media websites and their funding? Because I think this is significant. You see in the recent decades an exponential growth, what we call an organized Islamic network of pundits, bloggers, authors, documentaries, lobbyists, and elected officials even at the most senior level in terms of the kinds of rhetoric that they have in policies towards Muslims, whether you're talking about the US or France recently, Macron's policies, not just when he was running and his policy, which was very much almost as the same as Le Pen in some ways, but also, the way they approached handling the situation. In America, between the period of 2008 and 2013, more than $205 million was received by these kinds of authors and the kinds of websites that exist. Now, Islamophobia continues to exist in Europe, in the UK, France, Germany, Austria, Belgium, issues with regard to, headscarf, issues with regard to the Muslim community itself, mainstream Muslim community, and even in countries, ironically, where there are very few Muslims, Hungary, Poland, Sweden, Denmark, Australia. It's impacted the politics, but it's very importantly, it's impacted Muslim civil society, schools, mosques, organizations, mainstream Muslims. We're not just talking about the question of extremist here. And we see it expressed with, again, government bans on wearing the hijab, the influence or control of education, attempts to influence and even train imams or to keep certain imams out. I believe Austria has a regulation now that would keep imams from Turkey from coming and functioning in Austria. To actually, as has happened in France, but other places, closing of mosques and bans on civil society organizations. It's important to note that today in the US and parts of Europe, there's been a significant increase, on the other hand, in positive attitudes towards Islam and Muslim citizens and the integration of Muslims in society. That's not to deny that there is not an issue, for example, especially in certain European countries with regard to immigrants coming in or immigration. But in many countries, you see now second and third generations of Muslims who are able to get the education that they need and to function in society. Yet at the same time, Islamophobia and hate crimes continue to exist. Now, I just want to make one quick statement about global Islamophobia, which is outside what we're talking about today, but it's imperative today, given what's going on, to note the exponential growth of global Islamophobia in Asia. The genocide of ethnic Muslims, of the Uyghurs in China, more than 1 million, some say 2 million, who've been put in camps, so-called re-education camps. The Rohingya in Myanmar, more than 1 million impacted by that. And the Islamophobic discrimination and violence that we now see emerging in India, which is usually celebrated in the past as a secular and democratic country. The situation of Muslims is very serious in India and in Kashmir. Discrimination when it comes to education, but also violence and violent acts. And that, again, you could go to bridge.georgetown.edu or just look at a lot of other stuff in the media. Sadly, too often Muslim governments and some international organizations that are strong in denouncing Islamophobia in the West ignore denouncing Islamophobia in Asia. At one point, somebody observed a couple of months ago that they found it stunning that the OIC had not been more prominent in its denunciations. In the past, I know we actually at Georgetown, and at the time, Ibrahim Khalil was a professor at Georgetown, we did an international conference on Islamophobia. I would note that Turkey has had in the recent past and continues to have a number of universities that hold conferences on Islamophobia. So let me end by saying two things. One, if you want information on what I've been talking about, go to bridge.georgetown.edu. And you'll see, for example, on the first page, reviews on global Islamophobia, separate reviews on the US, Europe, Canada, China, India, etc. And the final thing is, for you who are students, it is very important, whether we're talking about the West or the Muslim world, education becomes very important. And that means education that's effective, that very often helps us to get, not only inform of us of things we didn't know, but helps us to get over sometimes the kind of biases that we have. I mean, for example, in the Gallup poll of 35 Muslim countries a number of years ago, what did we find? We found, yes, Muslims were upset globally. You know, majorities were concerned about Islam and Muslims and the attitude towards Islam, and Muslims and the denigration they felt. But on the other hand, they admired the West and for many, particularly the US, with regard to its education, its economics, the technology, and wanted those things and wanted responsible governments and democratization. So I challenge all of you to learn more, and it takes a long time, but I started from zero when it came to understanding Islam in the Muslim world, and I had to do that both with my study and also traveling some 3 million miles, covering a good deal of the world many times. So thank you for the invitation, and I'm happy to happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Professor, so much for your detailed and informative presentation, and also for sharing your personal expertise while studying Islam throughout your life. Thank you so much. And also, just a quick kind of addition to your last points on Islamophobia. Actually, the manifestations of anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia have ceased to be a phenomenon mainly widespread across the nations in the global north. As you pointed rightly, that Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang or Rohingya in Myanmar or Hindu nationalism in India, these are manifestations of a kind of a breaking point in the rise of global Islamophobia, and this demonstrates that there is a need to examine Islamophobia, not just a Western kind of phenomena, but also not just for global North, but also for a phenomena which concerns the global South. So this is a kind of a real global issue at the moment, and. Now I would like to open up a short Q&A session, and actually I would like to start with a question which a bit retrospective actually, and will take us back to the early 1990s. Now, in your seminal book, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, published back in 1995, in which you examine actually the vitality of Islam as a global force and the history of its relations with the West, you asked the critical question for that time: are Islam and West on an inevitable collision course? And that question actually reflected an increasing belief of the early 1990s that the clash of worldviews, values, and civilizations, which you have mentioned at the beginning, is leading to an impending confrontation between Islam and the West. And of course, this is a situation that comes from history of mutual distrust and condemnation. But at the same time, in the beginning of the 1990s or the end of the Cold War, that period marked a critical point in turning Islam as a worldwide religion into a threat, into a specter of an Islamic threat. And this, as you pointed out, reinforced exaggeration, distortion of the true nature of Islam and the political realities of Muslim world. Can we say that back in the 1990s, that vacuum created by the end of the Cold War was kind of filled by exaggerated fear of Islam as a resurgent new evil empire, as a new adversary for the West and challenge for global stability? Or to put it differently, is it possible to claim that red menace of world communism at that time was replaced by fear of green menace of Islam?
Actually, the answer is actually to that is both. When I finished the book, Islamic Threat, Myth, or Reality, I was concerned that the book get out quickly, with Oxford, because I thought, suppose the situation changes, I'll look like a fool, what I was writing there. Mm-hmm. But the very time when I had finished it, that same day, I was asked to brief an Assistant Secretary of State. And he began by asking me, will Algeria be another Iran? And I explained why, that you have to know the countries, the setup. I said, you don't want to think of it as a global threat. Well, I'm not necessarily saying it's a global threat, but with the end of the Soviet Union, if you look at the world, it's actually Islam and the Muslim world that would be potential to be a global threat. In other words, we've got a phenomenon that is global. So and then in light of the Iranian Revolution, that's what's in the back of his mind when he's talking to me, and I think that's what therefore predisposed the approach, and what exacerbated it is the trauma of fear that occurred and does occur when extremists and terrorists commit actions. A population is sensitive when so many times when there would be an extremist action wherever in the US or wherever. I can tell you that both, my friends who think along the lines that I think, as well as my Muslim friends, would say when something happened, oh, I hope it's not going to be something that's related to Muslims and Islam, because it'll just, even though this is still a minority phenomenon, if you will, in terms of the total population, in terms of it hitting the media and the way it then gets played, it will blow out of proportion, and certainly we see that in recent years, not just with mainstream media, and that's true, mainstream media, but particularly when you get the kind of Fox News and their equivalents in other parts of the world.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Another issue I would like to touch upon, ask you to touch upon, is kind of concerns the issue of the term of Islamic fundamentalism. Under the term fundamentalism, as we know, we understand the reassertion of religion in politics and society, and you also clearly emphasize this in your book and in your studies. And you emphasize that the common designation fundamentalism is overloaded with Christian and Western stereotypes. And that such interpretation implies a monolithic threat that does not exist, and that for that you prefer to speak of Islamic revivalism or Islamic activism instead of Islamic fundamentalism. Could you elaborate a bit on this differentiation and what delineates these two terms? Yeah,
I think that fundamentalism grows out of Christian fundamentalism, which developed in the late 19th and early 20th century. And today you see it among not all, but many evangelicals and Baptists who have this kind of literalist approach to religion. But also it affects the way they then, for many of them, the way they see Islam, in their criticism. And so my feeling was that it confused the two. And it brushstroked Islamic movements so that we didn't make the distinction between mainstream Islamic movements and extremist movements, but rather the phrase just was this negative phrase. But to show you the force of it, way back when, I was on a panel at the Middle East Studies Association, and it was a critique of the question of Islamic fundamentalism. And when it was over, I asked the guy who chaired it, I said, this was a great panel and we got this all straightened out. I said, but I notice you've invited me to speak tomorrow at your university in New York City, and you use the phrase Islamic fundamentalism. Why do you do it? And he smiled and laughed and said, because that'll bring an audience in. You see, but that's where it occurs. So if you talk about mainstream Islamic movements, as soon as you say it's Islamic fundamentalism, there's a whole sense that A, it's extremist, but also that there's a mentality there, you know, that's rigid and unable to deal, if you will, with what? The modern world.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe my final question is on Islamophobia and the limits of multiculturalism, actually. In one of your latest books, Islamophobia and Radicalization, you emphasize that Western countries have become and will continue to become more and more multicultural, multi-religious, and that diversity must be seen and promoted as a potential strength rather than an inevitable threat. And that mutual, kind of genuine multiculturalism must be embraced. And Ibrahim Kalın actually also in another book, which is co-edited with you, also talks about the growing complexity of cultural and religious identities, highlighting that multiculturalism has deepened in the Western societies and produced new kind of modes of identity. However, he also argues that multiculturalism has also reached its limits in the current debate over Islam and Muslims. And the reason for that is that the debate is shaped by the secular liberal ideals of the European Enlightenment, which struggles to accommodate in a non-Western religion such as Islam. And Muslim culture actually has mostly been defined as an oppressive force that only influences but not just determines, also influences the individual and collective thinking and behavior of Muslims. And in this sense, culture is employed in a way that denies human agency and defines individuals through their culture and treats culture as the explanation for virtually everything they do or say. And Ibrahim Kalın actually terms this cultural racism. And do you think that in this kind of environment, when cultural racism is widespread, genuine multiculturalism is possible across the Western societies? I think
there's a real danger to multiculturalism. And, you know, it used to be that those of us in the US would say, well, you know, the real problem is with France and its attitude. You know, we were still multicultural and they weren't. And then as things began to swing, I think where we are now with the rise of the far right, you know, whether it's in Europe or America, with this, and part of that far right, both in Europe and America, is a fear of immigration, of immigrants, of the other religion, a fear that the sense that one has that let's say America and Europe were white countries, white population, white, you know, so suddenly you know, both the look and the culture changes, you know, and so you have this great diversity. That kind of cultural diversity is often seen and exploited by the far right. And so whether you're talking about President Trump and his campaign, and many people in the Republican Party, there are some Democrats that are that way, but it's been you know, both before Trump and after Trump, there's been that mentality. And if you look at Europe, you look at the extent to which Macron, who's well educated and one sort of sophisticated in the last elections, was almost moving into the position of Le Pen, and also in France, where you see the extent to which, in effect, the current there is to basically say to be French. It's almost along the lines of what Le Pen sort of said. It's your whole identity should be that. So, you know, it should be your language, your culture. And she even said the cuisine, you know, the food that you eat, you know, et cetera, that kind of mentality. And I think that, you know, we see that now. You know, I did a brief in Australia for the Foreign Relations Committee, and the chair at that time was a woman who as a child had come from Greece to Australia. And she said, you know, in the past, before 9/11, she said, people were identified by their ethnic background. And that was true for Muslims. You know, you were Egyptian, you were whatever. She said, now the distinction is they're Muslim, you know, or whatever, you know. or in our country at times they're Sikh, you know. But I think that's the real danger in terms of the future. The kind of politics that we've seen both in sectors of Europe and America is frightening, you know, and especially, as I think I noted, maybe I didn't say it in my talk, you know, the threat in some of the Western countries are Western countries that don't have a lot of Muslims. You know, I was in a conference in Europe where a woman from Poland got up and said, the good news is we don't have many Muslims in Poland. She didn't really mean that literally. She said the bad news is we have Islamophobia. Yeah. And then I was at a conference in London, and a woman from Australia said almost the same thing, you know. So I think that this is a threat. I think multiculturalism is definitely, you know, a threat to various sectors in society. And in America, it's people of color, just in general. You know, let alone, you know, names, etc., you know, identifying people. And you see this sometimes reflected in that you can have a couple that when they have a child, they wind up picking a very, as it were, Western name, you know, so the parents can have an Italian or Turkish name, but now they say something like, oh, Larry. You know, and you want to say, well, I didn't know that somebody who's Japanese would have the first name Larry, you know. So I think it is. I mean, it's, I look back at my career and where I thought things were going, trajectory was going good. You know, we started, nobody knew anything about Islam and it was going this way. And the same thing was true of Palestine and Israel. And where are we today? We're 20 years behind in all of those areas, let alone Palestine and Israel.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately. Thank you so much, Professor Esposito. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate you coming on today to this live stream. I think we are approaching to the end, and I personally and our entire academic and student community are also grateful for your extensive work on the issue and your contribution to the academic literature, which kind of promotes a proper understanding of the true nature of Islam. Thank you so much, Professor, once again, and have a good day.
Thank you. And thank you for